USS Alabama, nicknamed the Mighty A, was an impressive piece of American engineering. She was the final South Dakota-class battleship to be built, and the sixth ship overall in the United States Navy to bear the name of the 22nd state. Her main battery guns fired a total of 1,252 rounds at enemy targets during her career. Her anti-aircraft guns downed 22 Japanese planes during her time in the Pacific, and she earned 9 battle stars for her efforts. Today, she serves as the centerpiece of a memorial park on the shores of Mobile Bay, dedicated to all Alabamians who have participated in the armed conflicts of the United States. Alabama's keel was laid down on February 1, 1940, and she was launched 2 years later in February 1942. She was built at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard and had an overall length of 680 feet and a beam of 108 feet. Her designed standard displacement was 35,000 tons, but the onset of war for the U.S. in late 1941 meant the end of all treaty requirements, and she would end up displacing almost 38,000 tons when completed. This change in displacement was due mostly to additional anti-aircraft weapons, and the crew members needed to man them. When fully loaded for combat operations, she displaced over 44,500 tons. Alabama carried a main battery of 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns, the same as her sisters and the preceding North Carolinas. These were housed in 3 3-gun turrets, a super-firing pair forward of her superstructure and 1 aft. Her main battery was capable of hurling the 2,700-pound super-heavy armor-piercing shell over 36,000 yards, or almost 21 miles. Her secondary battery consisted of 20 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns mounted in 10 twin turrets located amidships, with 5 turrets on each broadside. Alabama's original design called for her to be equipped with an anti-aircraft battery of 12 1.1-inch 75 caliber guns and 12 50 caliber Browning machine guns. But, with the onset of war, her AA battery was beefed up considerably, and she left the yard with 6 quadruple mounts of the much more effective 40mm Bofors guns in place of the 1.1 mounts, and her Browning machine guns were traded in for 35 of the venerable 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. By 1945, Alabama had a total of 12 quadruple 40mm mounts and 56 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikons. Unlike the preceding North Carolina class, the South Dakotas were designed with a zone of immunity against guns of a similar caliber to theirs. Alabama had an armor belt of 12.2 inches, which was internal and sloped at 19 degrees. This design afforded her more protection than her predecessors, even though her belt was only slightly thicker. Weight was also saved by designing the class almost 50 feet shorter than the North Carolina class, which offset some of the additional armor weight. In the end, she was immune to the shell fire of the older 16-inch 45 caliber guns of the Colorado class between 17,000 and 31,000 yards, and it shrunk to between 20,500 and 26,500 yards against the newer Mark VI guns firing the 2,700-pound super-heavy armor-piercing shell. Her deck armor was 6 inches thick, and she had 18 inches protecting the faces of her main battery turrets. Alabama received a SC air search radar and an SG surface search radar in 1941, while still under construction. A second SG set was added late in 1942. She also received a Mark III fire control radar set for her main battery and Mark IV radars for her secondary battery, with the Mark III being replaced early on with the more modern Mark VIII. Mark 12 and 22 sets eventually replaced the Mark IV sets. Her SC set was replaced by an SK air search set in 1944, and that was replaced by an SK2 set in 1945. Alabama was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers which fed steam to 4 turbines that each drove a propeller shaft. She was rated for 130,000 shaft horsepower and had a top speed of 27.5 knots with a cruising range of 15,000 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. Her peacetime complement was meant to be 1,793 men, but her wartime complement grew considerably to 2,500 officers and enlisted men. The Sodaks in general were already very tight and cramped ships due to their shorter hulls, But this was exacerbated by wartime requirements. Alabama was equipped with 3 Kingfisher float planes, which were launched from 2 catapults located on her fantail. Alabama commissioned into the fleet on August 16, 1942, a mere 6 months after being launched. She conducted her shakedown cruise in Chesapeake Bay during November before heading north to Casco Bay, Maine, where she operated until late March 1943. On April 2nd, Alabama got underway along with her sister South Dakota to reinforce the British home fleet, and arrived in Scapa Flow in mid-May. While attached to the home fleet, the job of the American battle wagons was to provide protection to the North Atlantic convoys from any German surface threats that might sortie from their bases in Norway, including the great German battleship Tirpitz. A surface engagement with the Germans never materialized, as they chose to stay within the friendly confines of their Norwegian lairs, and on August 1st, both ships were ordered stateside to prepare for operations in the Pacific Theater. Alabama arrived in Norfolk on August 9th, and over the next 10 days received an overhaul and repairs before getting underway for the Pacific on August 20th. On September 14th, Alabama dropped anchor in the New Hebrides. She spent the next month and a half training and conducting exercises with fast carrier task groups before sailing for the Gilbert Islands in mid-November. She screened for the carriers as they launched strikes to neutralize Japanese airfields in the Marshall Islands, then supported the invasion of Tarawa on November 20th. On December 8th, Alabama, along with South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Washington, shelled and inflicted heavy damage on Japanese installations on the island of Nauru, to the west of the Gilberts. After this action, she retired with the carriers Bunker Hill and Monterey, before heading to Pearl Harbor in early January for repairs and routine maintenance. Alabama rejoined the fleet on January 21st and was assigned to Task Group 58.2 of the Fast Carrier Task Force. Her task group got underway on the 25th to participate in the invasion of the Marshall Islands, and from the 29th through the 30th, she bombarded Roy Namur Island along with South Dakota and North Carolina. She hurled 330 rounds of 16-inch and 1,562 rounds of 5-inch gunfire toward Japanese targets, destroying planes, airfield facilities, blockhouses, buildings, and gun emplacements. She then screened for the carriers of her task group as they struck Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands on February 16th and 17th during Operation Hailstone. This operation focused on the installations, aircraft, and shipping located at the major Japanese base. Alabama and her task group then steamed to the Mariana Islands to conduct airstrikes, and it was here, while fighting off Japanese air attacks on February 21st, that Alabama suffered her first combat casualties of the war when 5-inch Mount No. 9 accidentally fired into 5-inch Mount No. 5. 5 men were killed and 11 were wounded in the mishap. After the strikes were completed, Alabama and her cohorts conducted a sweep looking for enemy ships to the southeast of Saipan, and having found none, retired to Majuro to replenish their fuel and ammunition. While anchored here, she served as temporary flagship for the commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force, Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, from March 3rd through the 8th. Alabama, now a member of Task Group 58.3, got underway on March 22nd for more strikes on the Caroline Islands. On the 29th, she helped defend her task group from air attack and downed one attacker while assisting in the destruction of another. She then supported the efforts of the U.S. Army along the western New Guinea coast in mid-April and shelled the Japanese airfield and seaplane base at Pohnpei in the Carolines on May 1st to neutralize it ahead of operations to take the Marianas in June. After a refit and a month of training, Alabama headed out in early June with the rest of the Fast Carrier Task Force for operations in the Mariana Islands. She started out screening the carriers as they conducted pre-invasion airstrikes. Then, on June 13th, Alabama took up station off the west coast of the island of Saipan and conducted a pre-invasion shore bombardment to cover minesweeping operations ahead of the invasion on the 15th. U.S. operations in the Marianas, which were considered to be a breach of Japan's inner defensive perimeter, brought out the Japanese First Mobile Fleet. Alabama was dispatched, along with the other 6 fast battleships of Task Force 58, 4 heavy cruisers, and 15 destroyers, to form Task Group 58.7 under the command of Vice Admiral Willis Lee. This unit was deployed to the west of the carrier groups between them and the most probable approach of the enemy. Although it weakened the anti-aircraft defense of the carrier groups, this formation provided a powerful surface unit ready for immediate action if Japanese surface units attempted an end run around Task Force 58 to threaten the invasion beaches, which had been ordered by Admiral Nimitz to be protected at all costs. On the morning of the 19th, Alabama's air search radar was the first to detect the initial Japanese strike at 10:06 a.m. at a distance of 141 nautical miles. Her report was confirmed by Iowa, and 40 minutes later, the attackers arrived over the fleet. The few Japanese flyers that managed to get through the intense U.S. fighter screen focused on Alabama and her task group, as they were the first U.S. ships they encountered. South Dakota took a bomb hit to her main deck, which caused moderate damage and about 50 casualties. About an hour later, a second wave, comprised mostly of torpedo bombers, bore in on her task group, and Alabama's AA barrage discouraged several planes from attacking her bloodied sister. The intense concentration paid to the incoming torpedo planes left one dive bomber undetected, and it targeted Alabama. Both bombs were near misses and caused no damage. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Alabama continued screening the fast carriers as they struck enemy shipping, aircraft, and shore installations throughout the Marianas for the rest of the campaign, occasionally returning to the marshals for upkeep and replenishment. On August 30th, Alabama got underway with Task Group 38.3 to aid in the seizures of several islands within the Caroline Group during the first 2 weeks of September. Then, Alabama and the Fast Carrier Task Force shifted their focus onto the Philippines as they conducted airstrikes throughout the island chain during the rest of September and into October, in preparation for the amphibious landing at Leyte on October 20th. Japanese facilities on Okinawa and Formosa were also struck during this time period by the Fast Carrier Task Force, and the AA gunners aboard Alabama were quite busy, shooting down several enemy aircraft and damaging others as they protected their flat-top friends. Just like in the Marianas in June, the landing at Leyte prompted action from the Japanese fleet. Alabama, now part of Task Group 38.4, screened the carriers as they conducted airstrikes against the Japanese Southern Force on the 24th, before they moved north and made a strike on the Japanese Center Force in the Sibuyan Sea. After receiving reports of a third Japanese force containing carriers, Alabama's group, along with the 2 other carrier groups, were ordered north towards Cape Engano, intent on putting an end to the Japanese carrier force once and for all. However, this was a decoy force, and the carriers had little in the way of air power. As Task Force 38 raced north, the Japanese center and southern forces attempted to converge on the U.S. amphibious force located in Leyte Gulf. The southern force was all but annihilated in Surigao Strait by the venerable old battle wagons of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 77, the fire support group for the Leyte landings. The center force, which was thought to be retiring to the west, regrouped and reversed course just before dark and made its way through San Bernardino Strait, emerging off Samar early on the morning of the 25th to the surprise of everyone in the U.S. 7th Fleet. This is where controversy erupted, as Admiral William F. Halsey had made plans to leave a powerful surface force of 4 fast battleships, including Alabama, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers, to guard the entrance to San Bernardino Strait. This force, designated Task Force 34, was in fact not left to guard the entrance to the strait, and instead raced north with Task Force 38. Halsey intended to attack the enemy carriers with airstrikes on the morning of the 25th, before having his surface units move in to finish them off. However, this would not come to fruition, as Alabama and the other elements that made up Task Force 34 were ordered to turn around and head for San Bernardino Strait, just as they were almost within gun range of the northern force. Task Force 34 raced south, but after a number of delays, including refueling the task force's destroyers, they were too late to provide any relief to 7th Fleet and missed the retreating center force as they headed back through the strait. After the Task Force 34 debacle, Alabama returned to her assignment of screening the fast carrier task force's flat tops. She operated in this role during November and December as the task force conducted airstrikes throughout the Philippines. As Alabama retired to refuel on December 17th, she began to encounter rough weather from impending Typhoon Cobra. At daybreak on the 18th, rough seas rendered refueling at sea impossible. There were 50-knot winds that caused ships to roll heavily. Alabama herself experienced rolls of 30 degrees and had both her float planes so badly damaged that they were of no value, and she received minor damage to her structure. At one point in the typhoon, Alabama recorded a wind gust of 83 knots. Alabama was sent stateside on the 24th to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for an overhaul, which lasted from mid-January to late March. She rejoined the Fast Carrier Task Force in early May as it conducted operations in support of the Okinawa campaign. On May 14th, several Japanese planes penetrated the combat air patrol and made attacks on the task force. Alabama's AA gunners downed 2 aircraft and assisted in splashing 2 more. Alabama rode out another typhoon on June 5th, then bombarded shore installations on Minami Daito Shima with her sisters Indiana and Massachusetts on the 9th and 10th, after which the fleet retired to prepare for intense attacks on the home islands that were set to begin in early July. These attacks focused on military and industrial targets around the greater Tokyo area, and on the night of July 17th, Alabama, along with 4 other fast battleships and HMS King George V, bombarded industrial facilities northeast of Tokyo. On August 9th, Alabama shelled targets at Kamaishi in company with 2 of her sisters and 6 American and British cruisers. She was supporting carrier strikes when word of the Japanese capitulation reached the fleet on August 15th. Alabama contributed personnel to the initial occupation force, who were some of the first to set foot on Japanese soil, and screened the carriers until she steamed into Tokyo Bay on September 5th. Alabama departed Tokyo Bay on September 20th and steamed to Okinawa to participate in Operation Magic Carpet. She reached San Francisco on October 15th, and on Navy Day, October 27, 1945, hosted 9,000 visitors. She then moved to San Pedro, California, and remained there until February 1946, when she left for the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for inactivation. Alabama was decommissioned in January 1947 and was assigned to the United States Pacific Reserve Fleet. She remained there until struck from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1, 1962. The state of Alabama formed the USS Alabama Battleship Commission to save their ship, much like the citizens of North Carolina did with USS North Carolina a few years earlier. Ultimately, they raised around $800,000, of which about an eighth came from the children of the state. The ship was awarded to the state in June 1964 and was towed over 5,600 nautical miles to her permanent berth in Mobile Bay, arriving in September 1964. She was opened to the public on January 9, 1965, and continues to serve as a reminder of the incredible sacrifices made by the men and women of her state during the Second World War. Thank you for watching. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content just like this.